So let's continue the conversation on the SASSA debacle. We speak now to Executive Director of the Social Policy Initiative, Isobel Frye, to get her views on the goings-on here. Isobel, good morning to you. There are two stories I'm going to tackle with you, and the first one has to do with the delayed payments of social grants. Do we know at this stage if there are still grant recipients who have not received their monies?
Thank you, Polly, and good morning to you and also to the viewers. I think you are right in asking these questions, and our concerns are really deep about the fact that there have been hundreds of thousands of really poor people whose needs have been disregarded by the poor service delivery and the use of Postbank, which seems to be failing drastically. With regards to how many people have not yet received their payments, particularly the old age pensioners, I'm not exactly sure how many are still outstanding. But this has disrupted hundreds of thousands of really vulnerable people. And we don't seem to see that there is a really great political commitment to ensuring that the system is improved.
Isobel, when we deal with these stories, and these are emotive by their very nature because they affect the poorest of the poor. I was listening on radio the other day, and a caller says, what you journalists should be asking the people in authority is whether or not they have poor people as their relatives, whether they have disabled people who are not able to put food on the table. It's a simple question, and I intend to ask that question when I come across them. But do you think that this is a fair question to those in authority, that when we put these questions to them, we make this be about the human beings that it is about?
It sometimes is difficult, I think, when you see repeated transgressions of what is required to ensure that people have a life of dignity as promised in the Constitution. And really, in thinking about the interview that we would have, I started off with a sense of anger that officials seem to have disregard for ordinary people's needs. And only what I looked at really is the Constitution, because there's a morality that comes within the state's obligations to meet people's needs. And if you look at the Frye judgment, which was a really groundbreaking one for our Constitution, it comes back to three things. It comes back to a deep sense of reasonableness of what is required. And just for me, what's really important is the reasonableness is not only this needs to be a reasonable program, but secondly, it needs to be capable of being reasonably implemented. And thirdly, there needs to be a budget made available. Now, if we look, for instance, at the 15 billion rand that was handed back by Department of Social Development to Treasury, because the system was not able to be functional to the poor and the most vulnerable, we have to look at, is it reasonable? Is it reasonable to give people 350 rand to meet their basic needs of dignity? That's an open question, and it seems to most of us as an equal country, no. Secondly, is the system capable of being reasonably implemented? And it seems from what social development is repeating that answer is no. Postbank, giving money to the old age pensioners, that answer is no. And thirdly is the budget. As we move towards the medium-term budget policy statement on the 1st of November, we are suspecting that Treasury is going to be cutting a lot of the social wage. That's not reasonable either. So if you go back to the morality and the constitutionalism of the obligation on the state to meet the needs of the most vulnerable, which are more than half of the population, we have to say that there is no reasonableness in it. So then the question is, what is the state doing in terms of reaching out to people, meeting people's basic needs? Middle-class people are concerned about the Eskom crisis, but for millions of people, the reality is the crisis of eating today, eating tomorrow.
Yeah. Earlier you said that it's sometimes hard to reason with those that are in authority when you are dealing with repeat problems. Okay? So the question becomes, are we being unfair to those who are in authority? Because if you read the newspapers this past weekend and you listen back to that media briefing that was given by the Minister of Social Development alongside the Minister of Communications in charge, who's in charge of Postbank. The understanding is that what they were trying to do is to ensure that there is no corruption. There is no corruption in the system. And what the Minister of Communications in particular was trying to do was to hold the board of Postbank accountable. Is that a good enough excuse for why the people experienced these glitches? Because I'm sure they don't care about those glitches. It's about, for them, putting food on the table, particularly for those who are sick. And they're saying, I've got to have a meal before I take my chronic medication.
It's a really difficult question, and I don't think, to my understanding and analysis and knowledge of the commitment, for instance, of the Minister of Social Development, there is a deep commitment to meeting the needs of the poor. There is, however, a sense of the need to govern in a clean and transparent manner, and hence the modes to redress and do away with corruption. I would say that what government needs to do, and it's a hard task to be in government, is to look at what brings the least damage. This is something in which vulnerability is primary, and destitution is awful. We don't want to be a situation where only where people protest is there a jumping to meet people's needs. There is the fact that there is such high corruption, and that takes away money from the poor, is a really bad situation to deal with. But do we not need to look firstly at putting the bread on the table? That is a constitutional right, it's a moral right, it's a budgeted right. And at the same time, look at ways and systems of ensuring that there is an honesty and taking into account the criminality that exists. But you can't say to people where there is no other hope that they have to suffer until government gets its house into order. That's something that really needs political commitment to see, as the United Nations human rights-based approach says, to see from the situation of the most vulnerable and to work from that, rather than saying, let's deal with it and people just have to persevere until such time as their needs are met. We don't have that luxury in a country where there are such high levels of destitution.
Talking about political commitment, the final question to you, Isobel, has to do with the matter you've already touched on, 15 billion rand that has had to be sent back to National Treasury because the Department of Social Development could not spend it. How are you justifying that when there are so many millions of people who are without food and rely on that 350?
Absolutely. And Frye, I'm not justifying it. What we try to do at the SPI is really look at ways in which we can solve for what's happening as a think tank. Now, we know that there are 12 million people unemployed in South Africa. It would make sense that 12 million adults were receiving the 350 grants. What we have learned is that the system itself is not capable of ensuring that the most vulnerable are able to access the grant. We've worked alongside people, beneficiaries, we've worked alongside the government department and shown where there is a lack of communication. The poorest and most vulnerable are the ones who are not able somehow to negotiate the obstacles that have been put in place to prove eligibility. And Frye, that really goes back to what we recommend, is that you've got to have a universal system, such as universal basic income, where everybody gets a grant, and SARS is then used to take it back from the middle classes. We clearly are not able to cover the most vulnerable by making sure that we have targeted systems. Therefore, if we give a blanket system, everyone is included. We don't have deficits in the programs of allocation, and from the middle classes and the rich, we take back through SARS. It seems in the face of the incompetence of the systems that have been rolled out that we need to try something very new and looking at it from the other way around. Rather than ensuring that the poor get poor programs, ensure that everybody has access to an affordable program, and the middle class and rich, as I say, use SARS, which is one of the most competent government or state agencies, to take it back. We can't keep on doing the same thing and expecting a different result when we're not able to improve the system. That really is what our research and analysis shows.
Final question. In the age of digital communications, Isobel, you have text messaging. Old people have phones now, mobile phones. You have WhatsApp. You have a sophisticated communications system in our days. How is it that this is not used to communicate to people, particularly the elderly, who still leave their homes and go and queue at the bank hoping that there is going to be money in there, and all that they are told by the ATM is that there is insufficient funds in their bank accounts? I'm simply trying to say, preventing people from going to a bank who ideally should have known via text messaging that there is no money, so I shouldn't go there today.
The point is, as you say, for every person who goes to the ATM, that's a cost in terms of money, also in terms of time. People without money go to try and claim money, and they have to repeat that time and time again. Absolutely, there are digital messaging, there are SMSs for people who don't have access to WhatsApp, but there's also the SABC. There are so many radio stations that can use the public service announcement to make sure that people are asked to not go until a certain amount of time. Retailers are also a point in which the messaging can be sent to people. So we're looking at a system where you have bureaucrats who are saying, we're trying to fix this system, just give us time. But it's not people-centered. People-centered means that we ensure that everybody has the message, they know what the situation is. We try to bring in alternative ways of meeting needs, saying to ShopRite, you've got such a reach, let's get food parcels, but primarily saying, how do we ensure that the anxiety that comes with somehow being out of control of having access to that small amount of money that comes, and how that impacts on your ability to eat, to feed your children. I would say that it's shocking the way in which the real needs of people have been disregarded. I don't think it's malicious, but I think that the performance level is incredibly disappointing in terms of having a pro-poor Ubuntu facilitated government delivery. And we also need to see what the urgent steps are to ensure that this doesn't happen next month or the month after that. We see that the Postbank, going back to the lack of payment of the old age pensions, the Postbank board has been fired and the one remaining person, they resigned and one remaining person has been fired. So what happens next? How do we ensure that this doesn't happen? And who's politically accountable and responsible? Who's really going to put their hand up and say, this was what I take responsibility for. I'm sorry to the nation. I'm sorry to the people whose lives have been so drastically affected. And this is what we're going to do to ensure that this doesn't happen again. That's what we need to hear.
Yeah. And Isobel Frye, I think you've hit the nail on the head, putting people first. And that is actually one of the principles that this government says it lives by, the Batupili principle. Thank you very much. Hopefully, they are going to start delivering on that principle of putting people first. All right.